Welcome everybody to the Convo Couch. This is Fiorella Isabel. I am here today with Martin Kulldorff. He is an epidemiologist, a biostatistician, focused on infectious diseases, outbreaks, and vaccine safety. Also one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. Martin Kulldorff, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So I just want to hear from you, your exact definition of what the Great Barrington Declaration is, because in Western media, particularly here in the United States, the mainstream media is painting it as eugenics. So I want to hear from you as to what it actually is.
Well, it's the opposite of that. It's how to better protect those who are most vulnerable in society. So the basic premises is that if you look at COVID, anybody can get infected, and most people will get infected sooner or later. But there is more than 1,000-fold difference in the risk of death between the old and the young. So for old people, this is a very serious disease. With a very dangerous disease because they may very well die from it. On the other hand, children, for children, this is a less deadly disease than a typical influenza season for the last 10 years, which typically has killed between 200 and 1,000 children every year. So if you want to combat COVID, the key thing that we emphasize in the Great Barrington Declaration is that we have to do a better job protecting those older people who are at high risk of dying from this disease. And there was sort of a naive thought that if you just sort of shut down everybody, you will somehow protect the old, but that's not true because you have to do very specific things. And they're very traditional focused protection things that we outlined in the Great Barrington Declaration, a long list that traditional public health that we could have done, but that we didn't do, which is very tragic because a lot of people died because we didn't implement those many of those measures. At the same time, if you lock down a society with closing schools, for example, or people not being able to go to the doctor, not being, you have collateral damage, both on education, of course, but also on public health. You have people who don't get their cancer screening or cancer treatment, and they will now die 3 years from now, maybe instead of 15 years from now. You have worsening cardiovascular disease outcomes. You have mental health problems, including suicides, worse diabetes treatment, lower childhood vaccination rates, as well as other vaccinations in around the world. So these lockdowns has had a devastating collateral damage on public health. So what the Great Barrington Declaration said was, we need to do a better job protecting those who are truly at high risk from this disease. At the same time, we have to let younger people live near normal lives so that you don't get all this collateral public health damage and other health outcomes. Because one of the principles of public health is that you can't just look at one disease. You have to look at health overall.
Yeah, and so does the Great Barrington Declaration say anything about protocols and vaccines in general? Because a lot of people say, well, this is very anti-vax. You are actually, your job is vaccine safety. You've done a lot of work in vaccine safety. So how do you feel about vaccines in general? And is there a promotion of any sort of protocol to actually treat COVID? Because a lot of the times, you're vaccinated and you get COVID. And the CDC has finally admitted that the vaccines do not stop the transmission of the virus. So people, were in America were given basically ibuprofen and told not to do anything else and just go home and only go to the hospital if they were really bad. And so then that's why you saw a lot of fatalities, because they would go to the hospital when their oxygen levels were at 70, and then they would be put on a ventilator and there was no treatment protocol.
So it's true that there are other scientists and also journalists and politicians who have called us anti-vaccine. I think that's to falsely accuse somebody to be against vaccines is one of the most anti-vaccine things you can do, because basically that's telling that there are professors at Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford who don't think vaccines are good. And then some people will believe them and say, well, if such faculty members don't think so. Why should I think so? So the people who are making false accusations of other people being anti-vaccine that's the worst anti-vaccine message you can do. So I'm very pro-vaccine. I've been working for vaccines for 20 years. I think vaccines is one of the greatest inventions in mankind, together with the wheel and writing and farming and so on. Sunetra Gupta, who is another co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, she develops vaccines. So she's obviously very pro-vaccine. And the same thing, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who's the third author from Stanford of the Great Barrington Declaration. So that's just nonsense that people are trying to, it has nothing to do with public health. It's contrary to public health, and it is very damaging to public health. And they do it for political reasons, for some kind. So it's very unfortunate. Now, being pro-vaccine doesn't mean that you think that everybody should take every vaccine. That has never been the thoughts in history. For example, for the COVID vaccines, it's very important that older people take this vaccine, because while it doesn't eliminate transmission, or it doesn't eliminate the risk of getting COVID, it does reduces the risk of serious disease and death. So it's very, very important that older people get these vaccines, and that should be the focus, to convince more and more people, older people, to get the vaccine, unless they've already had COVID. Because the other thing is, if you've already had COVID, then you have natural immunity. So you already have the immunity. You have better immunity from having had COVID versus the vaccine. It doesn't mean that people should deliberately get the disease. But once you've had it, for whatever reason, maybe you had got it before vaccines were available. Maybe you got it because you were delivering pizza to people. Maybe you got it because you were working as a nurse in the hospitals. Once you have that natural immunity, then you have superior immunity compared to the vaccine. So therefore, we shouldn't use the vaccines to mandate them, to mandate vaccines on people who already have excellent immunity. Instead, we should use it to older people who haven't gotten it, both older people in the US, but also across the world, because there are a lot of people in India, in Africa, in Latin America, and so on, older people who would greatly benefit from having the vaccine, but it's not available to them, because all these vaccine mandates and vaccine passports in the US and Europe are using the vast majority of the vaccine supply in the world. So mandating vaccines, I think, to people who don't need it is highly unethical, when there are a lot of people across the world who need it to save their lives. It's highly unethical, I think.
You talk about the consequences of lockdowns. Can you expand on that? I mean, you know, having people separated indoors, children specifically, away from any sort of normal lives. What does that psychologically do to humans? It's something that we haven't even begun really looking at.
I think that's true. I mean, there's going to be many studies in the years to come of the effects of these lockdowns. And if you look at, for example, you mentioned the school closings. Education is very, very important for children. And to close schools is very detrimental to children. They lose, the many children who has lost more than 1 year of schooling, and online schooling is not very efficient. And this affects, of course, the education, because you can never catch up with that. You will eventually learn how to read and write and so on, but you will never catch up 1 year of lost education. But it's also very important for the social development schools, where they interact with other students. It's important also for physical health. So, and we know all of those things, and that's one thing that the state ecologists of Sweden emphasized again and again, when Sweden decided not to close the schools during the first wave, and not subsequently either, that school is very important for the long-term health of children, both education, mental health, and physical health. So I think that's the biggest injustice that we have done during this pandemic, is to close the schools. And those the kids who are affected the most are the working class and middle class children, because the children of affluent parents they were often sent to private schools who kept open, or they were doing pod schools or having a tutor, or they could afford one parent to stay home to do homeschooling. So all kids were, of course, negatively affected by this, but it really hit hardest on the working class children and the middle class children. So in my view, these lockdowns is the worst assault on the working class in the United States since segregation and the Vietnam War over 50 years ago.
So there have been countless smear pieces against you. Recently, the most popular was by two people from the Daily Poster. Walker Bragman and Alex Koch wrote an article basically saying, and then they went on Democracy Now!, saying that you and your co-authors, Dr. Sunetra Gupta and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, are tied to the Koch network, saying that these ties are undeniable. They talked about the American Institute for Economic Research, which is AIERS, and those ties to the $100,000 donation. They mentioned the Atlas Network as well. They used the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, as a source. Can you respond to these allegations of funding?
I'm not quite sure what the Atlas Network is, but I've heard of the Koch brothers. I have no connections to the Koch brothers, neither do Dr. Gupta, Dr. Bhattacharya. So those are just blatant lies. The only connection I have with the Koch brothers is that I have worked for Harvard University, and Harvard University has received millions of dollars from the Koch brothers. Had nothing to do with any of my research, but I guess I have been affiliated with one organization at least who has received millions of dollars from the Koch brothers, just like they have. They send money, given money to many other universities across the US and other parts of the world. So this is just blatant lies and nonsense. What's really disturbing here is, I think, is the left is really shooting itself in the foot here, which I think is very unfortunate. I'm very, very concerned and sometimes depressed about it, because we now, more and more people are now realizing that these lockdowns had devastating consequences on the working class and the middle class, while they generated huge profits for Amazon and other big corporations. So to somehow try to claim that the focused protection on the Great Barrington Declaration, which more and more people realize would have been the right approach, that's just playing in the hands. To claim that that's a right-wing thing is just playing in the hands of the right wing by sending people there. Well, okay, if it was the right wing who had these good proposals, maybe I should be right wing. And if the left was against these good proposals and were in favor of school closures, well, I'm not going to be left wing. So right. It really is destroying. To make these false claims is actually destroying the left, I think. And I think wherever you are on the political spectrum, you need to have a strong left. I mean, you need to have strong advocates of the working class and the poor in a society to have a living and functional and good society. So I think the people who make these accusations, and it's not just the two you mentioned, the others, they are damaging the left more than anybody else in living memory, in my view.
So there was also recently a release of an email exchange between Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins, the director of the NIH. Does this basically prove what you've been saying? I mean, this was, where Collins said, "Hey, Tony," and sent it also to somebody named Cliff. He said this proposal from the three fringe epidemiologists who met with the secretary seems to be getting a lot of attention. And this was back in October of 2020. And even a co-signature from Nobel Prize winner Mike Levitt at Stanford. There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway? That was from Francis Collins. So does this kind of prove your point that these people are just going after you?
Well, it proves that there was a very coordinated attack on the Great Barrington Declaration. And that's not how science should work. Because science should work. If you have a different opinion, somebody has a different opinion, and it's getting attention, what you do is you have a public discussion about it. You invite them for a debate so that you can sort of discuss these things and then come with your views that are contrary to the ones you are sort of opposing. So I'm a very big fan of vaccines, for example, but I will never try to slander or smear or attack those who are skeptical of vaccines. Instead, I would like to have a discussion with them to sort of show my view why vaccines are very important for the health and well-being of the world, and across the board of very many different vaccines. So, but there was a similar, very coordinated attack by Dominic Cummings, who was the political strategist for the Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson. That he did. It came out in the proof of that came out in the book by Jeremy Farrar, who is sort of the Anthony Fauci of the United Kingdom, where there was a coordinated attack on the Great Barrington Declaration from Dominic Cummings and a group around him. So, I mean, he was in charge of the Boris Johnson campaign when he became prime minister, where he in the last election in the UK. So the irony is that you have these right-wing people like Dominic Cummings who are doing a campaign accusing the Great Barrington Declaration of being right-wing, which is completely nonsense.
So there's been an attack on doctors and scientists speaking out against the status quo narrative on COVID and how to deal with it. Recently, Twitter banned Dr. Robert Malone's for supposed vaccine misinformation. What do you think about this attack on anybody having a discussion regarding the COVID narrative?
It's the death of science, or death of the age of enlightenment, which we have had now for 400 years, since the pioneering work of Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, Galileo, and René Descartes. So it's very troubling, because if we let this continue, the scientific community will sort of deteriorate. And I think we do need science in this world. And there's a lot of skepticism right now, for very good reasons, both towards the scientific community and towards public health officials and public health scientists, even though they should be mostly directed to those people on top. So that's going to have spillover effect on many other areas where science is important. When we look at the environment, for example, distrust in scientists, in public health scientists, is going to lead to increase the trust in all scientists, including environmental scientists, for example. So this is going to have this kind of nonsense that has been going on with the pandemic and the shutting down of scientific debate, and therefore the distrust of scientific community of scientists. That's going to have very detrimental effects on many other areas, including the environment.
There's been a talk about a certain mass psychosis happening. Dr. Peter McCullough and both Dr. Robert Malone also mentioned this. Where are people in some of these people are just some sort of groupthink, right? People are just sort of following a sort of group mentality. Do you think that's happening right now? And how does that really affect the future of any sort of medical or scientific research?
So I'm an expert on these issues. So there are many others who can answer that better, but just suddenly to me seems to have been a lot of groupthink. And to be quite honest, I don't blame it, because Anthony Fauci, who is a lab scientist, immunologist, he sort of took charge and made a number of claims that are very surprising to somebody like me, who's a public health scientist. But he was sort of depicted as the infectious disease expert in the country by the media. So it's not at all strange that people believe what he was saying. So the fact that you get groupthink is not so strange, maybe. But and then when you sort of shut down other views, that just reinforces that groupthink. Right. So I think there's been some groupthink, but I'm not an expert on it, and I don't blame regular people for believing, for example, what Anthony Fauci said. Even though I think his understanding of public health is very limited, because he's a laboratory scientist, so he knows a lot about immunology and sort of what's needed to develop vaccines, which is not my area of expertise. That's more what Robert Malone does. My area of expertise is public health, and in public health, there are some principles that it seems like Fauci does not quite understand at all. One I mentioned is that public health is not just about one disease, COVID. It's about all things. So we have to look at effects on cardiovascular disease, mental health, and so on. Also, there was a lot of emphasis throughout this pandemic on the case counts in a particular week. But lockdowns just push things into the future, and public health is not just about the now; it's also about the future. And for example, cancer, the lockdowns have grave consequences for people with cancer, but that doesn't give mortality maybe in 2020 because it's more long term. These are deaths that we're going to have to live with and die with for many years to come. Also, public health is not just about the laptop class, I call it. People can work home from the laptop. Public health is for everybody in society, from the poor, the middle class, the working class, the upper class, also everybody, urban, rural, and so on. So that's one principle. And what lockdowns did, it protected the affluent laptop class while it threw the working class under the bus. Also, the public health is global. It's not just about the US or about US and Europe. These lockdowns have devastating effects in the developing world, where people who are living on the margins suddenly couldn't sell their vegetables on the market anymore. The market's closed, and now they starve. They have children starving, and many children starve because of these lockdowns, and even more had malnutrition. And if you have malnutrition when you're a child, that also have long-term consequences on your health until adulthood. So this was a catastrophe from top to bottom and from left to right.
So we have new variants, right? We have the Omicron variant that is extremely contagious and it's making its way around the United States. Now we have the coronavirus, which is the meshing of the flu and the coronavirus. As a public health official, how should people deal with these incoming variants?
So first of all, it's nothing strange to have variants. That happens. The viruses mutate, so you have variants. So there's nothing surprising with it. Omicron is more contagious, as you said. And that's not surprising either, because as you lock down, you make it with physical distancing, you make it more difficult for the virus to spread. So you sort of push the spread into the future. And one thing that does, it develops more contagious variants, because the other one are going to outcompete the other one. So first, Delta was more contagious, so it outcompeted the Alpha. And now Omicron is even more contagious, so it's outcompeting the Delta. Therefore, we have sort of just pushed the problem into the future, but also we have made it worse, because with the original variants, the level needed for herd immunity, which is when the pandemic ends, then we go to the endemic stage, is lower. The more contagious a virus is, or a variant is, the higher the threshold is for herd immunity. So the more people will get infected before the pandemic ends. So by doing these lockdowns before, we push into the future, but we also ensure that a higher percentage of the population is going to get infected before this pandemic ends, which makes it more difficult to protect those older, high-risk population.
So you're saying we shouldn't have any lockdowns for any of these new variants, because that would increase the likelihood of people getting more sick?
Yeah, at this point, Omicron is going to spread no matter what we do. So it's useless to have lockdowns. The only thing we have to watch out for is make sure that not too many people get sick at the same time. So we overburden the hospital system. But I don't think so. But the good thing here, it seems like Omicron is a milder, less serious variant, which is a good thing. It's not quite clear to me yet to what is because of the variant versus we have protection from vaccines against serious disease and death, and also from natural immunity. So I'm not sure exactly how much each of those three contribute. But whatever the proportions are, the effect of Omicron is less serious, which is, of course, usually.
Any final words of advice for people as a public health official to how to deal with so if you have Omicron, if you have any of these variants, how to actually treat it and how to not get, afraid, because there's a lot of fear being pushed on a lot of people. So people are freaking out. People who are vaccinated are getting it. People who are unvaccinated are getting it. How should people act?
So I don't think that people, young people, should be any more afraid of this than they are of the annual flu. For older people, they should be careful. They should make sure that they are vaccinated unless they have already had COVID. But the other thing we have to do is, as we now end as the pandemic will eventually end, because all pandemics end, what we have to do is we have to really take care of each other and give each other support, because this isolation that many have been living through has had bad impact on mental health and our social well-being and our psychological state of mind. So I think it's very important that all of us take care of each other, our neighbors, our friends, our families, members in organizations that we're part of, in schools, universities, churches, sports teams, and so on, and also random people we meet out and about. We have to try to treat each other very, very well with a lot of compassion. And one thing that's important is that you never ever blame somebody because they are sick. And when you have infectious diseases, you never blame somebody for passing it on to somebody else. That goes against fundamental principles of public health, to sort of blame, to do that kind of blaming. So we should never, ever, ever do that. There are unfortunately sad examples of that in history, from the typhoid Mary, for example, or through the AIDS crisis. There was a lot of that. And unfortunately, we have seen that now also during this pandemic. And we should absolutely, absolutely refrain from doing that. We should be caring and take care of each other. And I don't care where you are on the political spectrum, during a pandemic, we take care of everybody, whatever views people have in terms of religion, in terms of politics, in terms of sexuality, in terms of ethnicity, and so on.
Well, thank you, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, for coming on here and updating us on really what the Great Barrington Declaration is about. It is being widely misrepresented throughout the mainstream, and I just wanted to allow you to give your perspective on this. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.